mum and honoring my parents. And that was really what would drive me, to be quite honest, in just making my mum proud, not bringing any shame in my family. And I mean, I wouldn't even say that I learned how to cope with it. I just learned how to live with the culture clash. You know, you just learn how to live with it. But I didn't really even realize how much dysfunction it brought in my life, because like I said, I was actually quite happy just creating. I used to think that I had a really happy childhood, to be quite honest. It's only when I look back and I thought, oh my gosh, look at the dysfunction that I grew up in. But as a kid, I was happy just creating stuff all the time.
You said, of course, that your dad, he wasn't very affectionate, and sometimes he used to beat your mum or beat the kids. I mean, were you scared as a kid growing up in that situation?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, when, like, my dad never really hit my mum in front of us, but we would be accustomed to lying in bed at night, and then all of a sudden, while we were lying in bed, we'd hear like a familiar kind of like bang, and we might hear like a bit of a scream, and then we would know that, oh no, dad's got drunk again, and then we would just like stay upstairs just like petrified. As I got much older, I became like a bit more bold. And so I would begin to defend my mum. Like in my late teens, maybe around 15 or 16, I would then begin to actually defend my mum. But yeah, I lived in fear. Like we were constantly on eggshells, thinking, oh my gosh, we hope that dad doesn't get drunk, dad doesn't get violent. Like it ruled our lives. Subconsciously, we didn't even realize that that is what was happening.
And did you ever discuss this with your brothers or sisters at the time, or did you ever, say we want to do something about this, and your dad, or was it just something you accepted?
Yeah, it's like it is really like a cultural thing, to be quite honest. Like, again, all of us growing up would say that we had a fun childhood because we just cracked on with life. And I even remember on Christmas Day, one of the Christmas days, where my dad got violent and he threw us all out. And I remember the Christmas lunch was in the oven and everything was going to be served at like 3:00. But my dad ended up getting drunk and throwing my mum and all of us out. And then we ended up having to sit in one of our homes that my parents owned, like a home that they were renting out. And we just sat there on Christmas Day.
Wow.
I think we went to McDonald's. It was what it was. And whether we discussed it, we never discussed that we could do anything about it. We probably spoke about it just because it was our norm. But again, as my brothers got older, they also began to retaliate towards my dad. And as they became, maybe 16, 17, 18, they would then be more aggressive towards my dad. But then I would find that difficult to watch, because then I would see that as disrespectful towards my dad. It was quite dysfunctional dynamic, the whole thing, to be quite honest.
Okay. But did you ever get a chance to actually reconcile with your dad before he died?
Well, it's actually quite sad, because 1 week before my dad died, I had phoned him, and I mean, the thing is, I had a good relationship with my dad. Out of all of the children, I was probably his favorite, actually. And he probably hit me maybe about 3 times, not even hardcore, when I was growing up, compared to my other, my siblings. And so I would often call up my dad, told him that I loved him, etc. And so I had spoken to my dad a week before he died, and I had told him that I loved him, even though he wasn't super affectionate in return. He died a week later. But I had peace in my heart that even though it happened suddenly, I had told him I loved him. It was more difficult for the rest of my family, because 6 months previous to that, my sister had run away from home. As a result of it, my dad had beat my mum. My dad had disowned my sister. My parents had separated. They never reconciled before he died. And my sister never reconciled with him before he died. And so, because my sister isn't a Christian, she hasn't been able to process that or deal with that. So again, so much dysfunction. But I know when my family gets saved, I know that the Lord will heal all of that, even for my sister and my brothers as well.
Now, you also mentioned that the family were very religious. You used to have prayer meetings, and you had the Hinduism. Now, you told us a story about the demons attacking you. Do you think there's a relation there between the Hinduism and the life that you went through and the final attack with the demons?
I definitely think that all the things that I guess had access into my life as a child, I definitely think that the occult practices definitely contributed to that. I certainly do think that. However, I think the probably one of the root issues was the sexual abuse. I think the fact that I was sexually abused as a child, I think that coupled with the occult practices probably opened the door to having demonic visitations, because that sex demon that I had when I was 13, that visitation that I had in my dream, that sex dream that I had, was actually a sex demon. And throughout my whole life, I would have sexual dreams, as are quite common. You know, people have sexual dreams and they're perverse, and people don't realize that they are actually visitations from sex demons. And so when I had that sex demon at the age of 13, I had sex demons visiting me through my whole sleeps, you know, in my whole life. It wasn't until that demonic attack while I was wide awake from a sex demon, I then backtracked. God showed me that it was the same thing. It was the door that had opened when I was 13, and it continued to visit me until that attack, when I actually realized what was happening. And I asked God to help me, to deliver me, to get rid of these demons that actually had access to me because of all the junk that happened to me as a child.
Now, just before that, of course, when you were 12, you met Caroline and you said you became a Christian. Did you think that your life was just about to change then?
Not really. Like I didn't think my life was going to change. It was fun. It was fun going to this girls' club. I was grateful that, oh my gosh, I've met this living savior. It definitely brought peace to my life. You know, I was being bullied at school, and I remember during my teenage years being bullied and not going to school for 6 weeks, like being so depressed. But Jesus really helped me. Like he was my Prince of Peace. I would pray, I would read scriptures. He would comfort me, even though I felt like my life was falling apart as a 13, 14-year-old. So although I didn't know that my life was going to change when I met Jesus, but he definitely helped me in my teenage years. And I actually don't know what I would have done if he wasn't the God that I was following.
Excellent. Now, of course, you said your life got worse after that, basically. You got even worse because you had no boyfriends. Your mum got blamed that there's a boyfriend and things like that. And he said your main desire was protecting your mum.
Yeah.
Where do you think that desire came from?
I think, like, I mean, most of us have like a...
Life stories.
Like a protective, nurturing heart, I think, towards their mum, unless obviously, you know, you've maybe had a dysfunctional relationship with your mum. Like my relationship with my mum was actually very close. And so I always just felt this pressure that when I would watch her, you know, I remember one point where at 7 o'clock in the morning, we looked out of the bedroom window and we saw my mum being taken in a stretcher to the hospital after she had overdosed. And so for me, the pressure was, I just didn't want anything that I could do with, you know, anything that I could do to protect her. I wanted to do it because I didn't want my mum to be harmed. I didn't want her to take her own life. You know, I think any child would be overcome with that kind of protective heart, knowing that their actions could have a knock-on effect on the most special person in their lives. And if their lives could be endangered by their actions, they're going to try their hardest to not do those things. But it was hard for me because I was wild. I was born in the West. I wanted to do those things. They were normal for my friends, but for me to do those things, it could cost my mum everything. And so I wanted to protect her, but the only way I could do that was by living a double life.
Yeah, did your dad ever find out that you actually climbed out the window?
Do you know what? My dad didn't, but there would be times where I would come back from my bedroom window and my mum was in my bed.
Right.
And she had caught me. So, I mean, there's times where I I would there was one occasion where I'd snuck out of the bedroom window to go to a party, and then I'd forgotten that I'd left my Oyster card at home. So then I came back past my house to collect my Oyster card. And then as I walked past my front of my house, I see my mum looking out of the window, and I think, oh my gosh, my mum's there. So then I run to the back of the house, I jump on a car, jump on the roof, jump through my window, pull out my hair, just get under the duvet, and it takes me about 30 seconds to do that. That's the time it took for my mum to go from the bedroom and her bedroom to my bedroom. And then she knocks at my door, because she's like, I swear I just saw Bobbi on the street. She knocks at my bedroom door, and I open the door like, Mum, are you right? And she just looked at me like, what is going on? And she said, oh, Bobbi, I'm so sorry, go back to sleep. Like, that is the way that I lived my life out of windows.
Well, you said it got even worse when you encountered R&B music. What is it about the music that dragged you deeper?
It is the spirit behind the music, because I mean, not all R&B music is wrong by any stretch, but the very spirit behind rhythm and bass music is oftentimes, not always, but at times, in a worldly perspective, the spirit behind it is fornication, it's perversion, it's uncleanness, it's lust, all of those things. And when I began to listen to the music and hear the lyrics, it really renewed my mind in a negative way. I found my mind being transformed towards darkness, because up until that point, I still had a line that I would not go beyond. I wasn't going to have a boyfriend because it's going to jeopardize my mum. But as that music, and I used to listen to it 24/7. There was a radio station called Choice FM, and I would have it on 24/7, even while I was sleeping, whatever I was doing, Choice FM was on. And so that ideology, that way of thinking actually became so implanted in my own neurology that I wanted what they were talking about.
Okay, because it drags you into drink and drugs and the 3Ds, drinks, drugs and dancing.
And dancing, and promiscuity, sleeping around.
You've also told us about a few sexual encounters you've had as well, and you've had 2 terminations. How did you cope with those situations, all right, even when you look back on them now?
Well, I think part of the reason that I took so many drugs and drank so heavily was to escape the self-hatred that was, culminating inside of me. But actually, when I became a Christian, one of the first things that God did was he really convicted me about these 2 abortions. And as soon as this is when I became a Christian the first time round, in terms of in my 20s, when I realized that, oh my gosh, I actually need God, otherwise I'm going to go to hell. And the very first thing he did was convict me about my abortions. And I remember lying on the bedroom floor, weeping my eyes out for like hours, just knowing that what I had done was so terrible. And I remember God feeling a sense that God had forgiven me. But as I then became a Christian, as I gave my life to the Lord, over the next 10 years, I still didn't forgive myself for those 2 abortions. And when people would talk about babies and they'd say, oh, do you want children? In my mind, I'd think I'm not allowed to have children because I killed 2. And I would calculate how old they would be. And every time I would think about them, I'd stop thinking about them because of the guilt and the shame. I would wonder, am I ever going to, what happens to them? Did they go to heaven? And then I'd think, will I see them in heaven? Then I think, oh my gosh, no, I hope I don't see them in heaven because they're going to hate me. And these were the things that were going around in my mind subconsciously, even as someone that's now been set free with Jesus, living a successful Christian life. And then God began to minister to me and show me that babies that get aborted, they go to heaven. And I was listening to a teaching by a woman, and this might be out of people's grid, but there's a particular woman that I listen to. She has many visitations when she goes to heaven. And she was just sharing that when she goes to heaven, she sees all the babies that have been aborted. She sees them in heaven. She also shared that these babies, they pray for their parents, that they don't have hate towards their parents. They pray for their parents, that you can name these babies, that these babies celebrate your birthdays. And so I ended up naming the 2 babies that I had aborted. I sat at my kitchen table with the Lord, and I wept and wept and wept, and had the most beautiful encounter with God, where I named them and I gave God all my shame, all my guilt, and he just flooded my heart with such grace and joy. And so I have complete peace even about those things, because he healed my heart. And I know one day I'm going to see my 2 babes, and they're going to love me, and I'm going to love them. Wow. And I'm going to be with them forever. And so Jesus has really healed me in places where I don't even deserve healing. So he dealt with all of that through his goodness. Wow.
Well, in the midst of all of this course, you said you went to London to do a fashion course, but you failed.
Yes.
Now, what I'm really intrigued about is how you managed to convince your parents that you passed.
Well, you know what? The thing is, if you knew the amount of times where I did get caught with things that I was lying about, but I think my mum truly wanted to believe me. She believed that I was she wanted to see the best in me. And so sometimes I believe that even if my mum knew I was lying, I believe that out of her desire to see the best in me, she would just believe me. And my parents were trustworthy. If I say to them, oh, I'm sleeping at my friend's house tonight, they would believe me. If I could lie to them and they would believe me. That was the heartbreaking thing, because they are good people and they wanted to believe their children. So I got away with a lot of things simply because they trusted me.
Well, you failed, but you did manage to get on another course, and you are now a fashion designer. Tell us how that came about, and a bit about what you do at the moment.
Basically, when the Lord said, be a teacher, mm-hmm. I was like, okay, God, I'm going to be a teacher, but in order to be a teacher, you have to teach in the area of your degree.
Yep.
So when I had initially finished my degree, I had barely scraped through, just about made it through that degree. And I didn't want anything to do with fashion. I just wanted to be high all the time. And so when I actually became a Christian and God began to lead me to be a teacher, you have to teach in the area of your degree, which meant that all the fashion that had died, all my, everything that I had even thrown away when it came to fashion, it's like it came alive again. And so I became a fashion teacher. And as I began to teach these children, really what the school didn't realize is that I was making everything up, because I'd failed all my courses. And so the only thing really that I knew about fashion is what my mum taught me when I was growing up, because my mum was a machinist. So I was self-taught. Everything I knew about fashion is what my mum taught me, not what the London College of Fashion taught me, because I was never really there. And so when I'm a teacher and I'm teaching all these kids, and God really is training me while I'm training these children. And so I was a teacher for 8 years, and around me, all these precious young children are coming into their creativity. They're creating all these fashion pieces. And at the same time as I'm teaching them, God began to revive the desire within me to create fashion for myself again. And so after 8 years, God said to me, Bobbi, you're about to resign. And so I resigned as a teacher, but at the same time, he said, start creating. And so by faith, I began to live by faith. I had no idea where my salary was going to come from. I just knew that God had said, create. And so I created this fashion label, and that has now been going for 10 years. Wow. And the whole time, I didn't do it with like a business plan. I didn't do it with the aim of making a profit. I just did it with this seed within me where God said, start creating the way you used to create when you were a child. And then that became a fashion label that he really revived from the dead, because in my own strength, I never would have known how to birth a fashion label, but it all came out of the goodness of a creative God.
From what you've said, Bobbi, I think it's just what most fashion people do. They make things up as they go along, won't they?
Yeah. Yeah.
Tell us where we can access your fashions, or what kind of things you actually make.
Totally. I have a website, livinginlight.co.uk. Mm-hmm. And that's got my fashion on it. It's got my blog. It's got my workshop. It's got the stuff that I teach on sacred sexuality. It's got my podcast. It's got everything. It's got my testimony. The whole 9 yards can be found at livinginlight.co.uk. Do
you think you've got anything that would suit me or Alan?
Well, I can make bespoke things, so you can place an order for something that fits you perfectly.
Now, of course, you have moved on, of course. You said you're a chaplain in the strip club. How did that come about?
So I remember maybe about 6 years ago, I remember hearing an interview on Premier Christian Radio, and it was someone sharing about a ministry called Club Angels. And so these Club Angels, they go into nightclubs and they just help clubbers. They help them get home. They clean up their vomit. They share the love of God. They give out brownies. They just love people. And I was like, oh my gosh, that sounds like something I could totally do. So then I joined this ministry called Club Angels, and it was wonderful. We saw people get saved. You know, we were able to share the love of God with so many people. But the two women that were leading that ministry, God laid it on their heart to begin to pray around Soho. And so they did that for 18 months. And then as they did that, God began to lead them into strip clubs. And God really just got the strip club managers to invite these two girls in as strip club chaplains. And they have full permission to, you know, help the dancers, love on them, give them gifts, share the gospel, pray with them. And so I ended up also joining that ministry and becoming a strip club chaplain. And I still do it. I did it this week. Last week, one of the dancers came to the Lord. It's a powerful, powerful ministry, because obviously a strip club or a nightclub is the last place you would expect to encounter the love of God. But God shows up week upon week with these precious women and just comes in the middle of their circumstances and lets them know how precious and loved they truly are.
I wanted to ask you as well, you said your mum, she said when you went back to live in your own home, she showed mercy, and she also became a Christian. Yeah. Tell us how your mum's getting on now. How's she doing?
Yeah, she's doing amazing, because after my dad died, that's really when my mum, I guess, truly committed to her faith. And the Lord began to give her a vision of what to do with her life. And she was like nearing 50 now. And the Lord took her back to an encounter that she had had when she was 10, when her own dad had died, and her mum took her to an orphanage because her mum couldn't cope with looking after this girl, and so left her at this orphanage. And then that night, my mum went through so much turmoil because she couldn't believe that her mum had abandoned her. And so early the following morning, about 7 o'clock in the morning, my nan just turned up at the orphanage, and she just banged the door down and she said, give me back my daughter, give me back my daughter. I regret what I've done. Give her back to me. And so that day, my mum made a vow as a 10-year-old and said that one day I'm going to have an orphanage. And my mum wasn't a Christian then. She was a Hindu in her childhood. And so fast forward 40 years, when my mum begins to ask God to show her what her purpose is, the Lord gives her a vision and reminds her of that vow that she had made when she was 10. And in a dream, he shows her a vision of a plot in India and these keys, and he shows her the plans for the orphanage. And so she goes to her pastor, and an architect makes up the plans that she had seen in her dream. And my mum then, over a period of time, remortgages her houses and then moves to India, and then creates, like, from scratch home for children. She then adopts 20 children. And so now she lives in India, and she has this children's home. She runs a home for the elderly. She in fact has 2 children homes. She is such a Jesus freak. She loves the Lord. You know, both of us, like, we just love the Lord so much. And the crazy thing is that I lived most of my life in secret, not sharing my life with my mum, like keeping this double life and hiding so much from her. But then when she became a believer, I was able to tell her my whole story, and she showed me again so much mercy and grace, and she's like a best friend now. And all the secrecy that I had to live through when I wasn't a believer, hide from my mum.
Life Stories.
She now becomes the first person that I share my heart with. So the Lord has even redeemed all of that in such a phenomenal way and restored what I didn't even realize could be restored. So yeah, my mum is amazing, and the Lord has just blown her away with his goodness.
And finally, what about the rest of your family? How did they react when your mum became a Christian and then you became a Christian? How did they react?
I think for my brothers, because we used to take our drugs together and we used to party hard together, initially that brought a rift because they were like, what the heck is wrong with our sister? But over time, as they saw the transformation in my life and they saw the way that the Lord would bless me and my mum and the miracles that they began to witness, all my family members, including my sister, they hold me and my mum in such high regard because they can't deny the power of God in our lives. Like they have watched our lives get radically transformed. And although they haven't yet made the decision for Christ, we know that every one of our family members is being impacted by our witness and by the goodness of God that radiates through our lives. And so they really honor and respect us. And they have so much value for this God that we serve. But I know my family's going to be saved. I know my family is going to be saved. And I know the Lord is ministering to them in their own ways. So watch this space. Because,
well, having listened to your story, you certainly give credence to that 1970s song that girls just want to have fun. But having said that, you've made lots of decisions in your life, and I always ask this question of the guests that come on here. What was the best decision you ever made in your life?
Yeah, I mean, saying yes to the Lord, definitely. I mean, I cannot believe that he has taken me out of darkness in this way. Yeah, so inviting Jesus as my Lord and my Savior, best decision ever, 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 ever.
Excellent, Bobbi. Let me say it, Bahat Shukriya. And let me hand back to Alan.
But thank you so much. It's been wonderful hearing. And thanks, Abigail. Abigail has been there in the background, interpreting into Russian in a wonderful way. And that's been going out into Ukraine, and many, many other people who speak Russian are going to hear this wonderful story in the coming days. Thank you, Abigail. You've done a wonderful job. We appreciate you so much. Thank you, George. Thank you, John. And again, thank you, Bobbi.
Pleasure.
Can I invite you to join us again next Monday at 8 o'clock for another live story on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. And next week, we go to Australia for Dr. Nathaniel Costia. He is a coach helping people to really develop what they are really meant to be in life. You'll hear more about that next week at 8 o'clock, coming from Australia. So thank you all so much. May God bless you. May you know the peace of God which passes all human understanding. And may the joy of the Lord fill your hearts. Good night, everyone. God bless you.